Oh howdy all, grab yourself a drink, it is time for some PathOfExile discussion. Welcome to day 15 of the Settlers expansion. Today I wanted to take a look at the solo self-found game mode and the 12 builds that have been putting up the best results so far in the league as we've seen it to this date. Now this is going to be looking at the meta that's been developing in solo self-found, but I do think it's worth keeping in mind that even though I did a video on this for trade earlier, you might find, even if you're only a trade league player, that there's some things that have come up in SSF that actually could work for you in trade. Likewise, if you're primarily a solo self-found player, you might find that some of the tech that trade league players are doing, some of it's not going to be replicable in solo self-found. For instance, builds that rely upon getting replica Elbron's Warpath, they might be quite hard to get going. But a lot of other builds will cross game modes pretty well, and you can have a look at both videos for some inspiration. In any case, in the last 20 seconds of this video, I'll put up a link to the trade video on the screen. A couple of quick comments on build diversity here. Solo self-found build diversity is at an all-time high when you pay attention to the skills that players are using. There's more variance among skills. However, there's been quite a consolidation on a couple of ascendancies. You will notice that when we look at the level 92 plus players, which is going to be the primary cutoff point that I use for this video, you'll see that the Gladiator is absolutely hegemonic. If you look only at level 99 and 100 characters, you'll find the Hierophant is hegemonic instead. The Gladiator is still doing pretty well, but the Hierophant is head and shoulders above everything else. Essentially, what we're seeing is a pattern where there's a real consolidation on a couple of ascendancies, but there's a lot of different builds being played within those ascendancies. The key thing though, and I think the reason a lot of people are very happy with this league so far, is a lot of these builds were not particularly popular last league, which means that whilst a lot of last league's builds that were popular do still work, people are trying out new things in this league, and as a result, having more fun and sticking around playing the game longer. A quick note on the methodology that I use in this video. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because I discussed it in more depth in the Trade League video, and it's pretty much the same thing. Now, Grinding Gear Games published the ladder, a list of the top 15,000 players dynamically updated by their current experience points, and currently at the time I'm recording this in solo self-found, the cutoff is somewhere in a level 87. This gets scraped by the website POE.ninja, which then has a lot of data visualization tools that you can use in order to drill down on particular aspects of it. Now, I have arbitrarily decided I'm going to be cutting off at level 92. The reason I picked 92, and this is somewhat arbitrary, is that I feel like choosing 92 is at a point where if someone is an experienced player and they feel like their build is a complete and utter failure, they'll pivot away from it before 92. They might brute force it up to 88, 89, but once you start getting to the point that each level takes a bit longer and each death sets you back a bit more, you're more likely to say, no, I'm going to respec right now if you feel the build is a failure. So you get rid of most of the builds that people are genuinely unhappy with, but you still are setting a bit of a milestone that is not in any way an elite milestone. You don't need to be a top 2% player to reach level 92 in solo self-found by day 14. Lots of good players don't make it because they're busy with other things in their life, but among the players who do have time to dedicate to league start, you'll find that there'll be a large variety of playstyles that get represented. It won't just be the very best, but at the same time, people will have abandoned builds they're genuinely, completely and utterly unhappy with. There's a couple of other really meta-warping things that happen. You'll find that game hard modes, including solo self-found, do constrain what builds work well, and also you'll find that the availability of good guides, especially guides that are useful to both beginning and intermediate players, like Pox's Guide to Righteous Fire, these end up being a really big force in changing the way the meta feels. Anyways, this league has been extremely popular, but a lot of that popularity has been over in the Trade League. In Trade League, there's a whole bunch of new tools to play with, there's the currency exchange, a whole lot of things people have been waiting a long time for, and so a lot of lapsed players have probably come back, but the lapsed players are probably going into Trade League. Most of the people playing solo self-found, as far as I can tell, are people who played solo self-found last league and the league before and the league before that, rather than people who last played the game entirely way back in patch 3.18, or maybe even as far back as patch 3.2, as was the case for one person who commented on one of my YouTube videos recently. In the Trade League version of this video, I discussed the way that the Kingsmarch mechanics had quite an impact on which builds appeared on the ladder. I don't think that any of that applies in solo self-found really, except to say that specializing in Delve is something that I feel the Kingsmarch mechanic pushes a little bit against. Specializing in Heist as well, but most people who play a lot of Heist in solo self-found, they're just playing it until they get a particular unique or a particular item they're chasing out of Heist, and then they leave it entirely. So people don't necessarily build a build with a view that I'm just going to heist the entire league, the way that people do sometimes do in Trade League. For that reason, I don't think the fact that Delve, Heist, and particularly the Sanctum are awful for gold is going to have all that much impact on the way that the league is going to feel in solo self-found, and it's not going to be a major factor in which builds people choose to play. The one thing that I would say this league mechanic does reward is builds that can clear tier 17 maps fast, but if you can't clear tier 17 maps fast, then clearing tier 16 maps at lightning speed may actually end up being even better, and that's another option that you've got if you need to farm a lot of gold. People will want a lot of gold later in the league in solo self-found, but also with trade not being something that's competing with your gold, you've just got Kingsmarch, you don't have to worry about using it for trade as well. That's going to be another factor that means that gold is just a bit less important than it is over in the trade league. Now, there's been a major melee overhaul, of course, in patch 3.25, and it's been a huge focus of the entire expansion. A very large number of very, very good skills, like Elemental Hit of the Spectrum, have seen tremendous declines in the amount they're being played. And I think the major reason here is that people are just interested in checking out things that are shiny and new. I think this effect is even stronger over in solo self-found land than it is in the main trade league. You will notice when we get to the Ascendancy spread that of the top 8 Ascendancies, all of them except for Hierophant are very much melee capable, although some of them, like the Trickster, do include a few popular builds that are not melee based. 2 Ascendancies were overhauled in this patch. We saw the Gladiator Overhaul. This one has been a smash hit, especially in solo self-found. In fact, when we look at solo self-found, we'll see that the Gladiator Ascendancy is one of the most dominant Ascendancies we've seen in a long time, representing more than a quarter of the level 92 plus player base. As for the way people are building their Gladiators, pretty much everyone is taking More Than Skill, the 4-point block node, and then on top of that, people are taking Bleed Explosions and they're taking Jagged Technique. It's not that every individual Gladiator is running Jagged Technique, there are alternatives. There are definitely people who are speccing into Retaliation skills instead, but that 4+4 spread is the most common by far. We also, of course, had the Warden Overhaul in patch 3.25, or more specifically, the removal of the Raider and its replacement with the Warden Ascendancy. This Ascendancy is strong, it's also complicated, and it's something that was not that well understood going into the league. There are plenty of players who are like, right, I'm going to force this to work, and many of them have made solid builds out of it. It's overwhelmingly being played with Lightning Strike, and there's 2 build guides, one by Locus, one by Pelsteron, that have been particularly popular on this Ascendancy, and potentially more that haven't come to my attention. Over in Trade League, pretty much everyone is running 2 Tinctures, Uber Freeze, and Avatar of the Wilds. In solo self-found, there's a little bit more variety that we're seeing, but the setup that's so dominant in trade is still the most popular choice. It's just that it's not quite as ubiquitous as it is over in trade land. As for other patch changes, there are a lot of changes to physical damage being shifted into various elements. This is now a much harder stat to get than it used to be. The consequence of this is that even though Lightning Coil is very much self-farmable, you can absolutely get yourself a Lightning Coil via divination cards if you're keen to do so. It'll take you a little while, but it won't take you forever. This is just not something that all that many people are doing this league. When we have a look later at some of the Breakout Uniques, you'll see other tier 3 rarity uniques, so the same rarity as Lightning Coil, that are seeing much more use than Lightning Coil, whereas in the past it was far, far, far more popular than anything else. So basically, Lightning Coil is out, and having more life and more base defenses on rare gear, that's in its place. For people who like ranged combat, the wand buffs have been significant, and they've often shifted people away from bows and onto wands. It's not like this has absolutely destroyed bows or anything like it, but wands are definitely up, and when we come to the range skills that are popular, you will definitely see that. The Blood Magic Keystone that you can find on the passive tree, I mentioned in the trade video I was surprised at how popular it was. Well, in solo self-found it's even more popular. 25% of players are eliminating all mana issues on their character and also eliminating all mana through the use of the Blood Magic Keystone. This is a heavy price to pay as it interferes with your reservations, but can't argue with the results there. It is definitely working for a lot of people. Other things that are being used a huge amount as a result of the patch note changes: Resolute Technique, Unwavering Stance, and Iron Reflexes. These weren't changed, or Iron Reflexes was shuffled around on the passive tree, but it's still fundamentally the same thing it used to be. Versatile Combatant, though, it got giga buffed and it is being used a lot. Versatile Combatant's gone from almost never being seen to very, very common to really ubiquitous on builds that are in the bottom area of the tree and that have any investment in block. This Keystone is phenomenal now. You should either take it or have a very good reason for deviating from that plan. Okay, so here we have the Ascendancy spread in patch 3.25. Now, this is something that tells a story, and that story is not particularly pretty. We have an Ascendancy spread diagram where 50% and more of the player base are running 3 different ascendancies: Gladiator, Hierophant, and Slayer. This is level 92 plus characters, remember. There is a little bit more diversity than that when you look at characters that are in the 80s, but that tells a different story, and that is a lot of people who start out with something else and then either wind up changing into one of these ascendancies or walking away from the league. So what's going on here, and do we have a problem? I think we've got less of a problem than it looks like, and that is because this league, 2 of these ascendancies saw substantial buffs and also substantial changes. The Gladiator, they were all direct changes. That's because you had the massive overhaul of the entire ascendancy. People are excited to play things that are shiny and new. It's no real surprise that this ends up being so much larger than everything else. Likewise with the Slayer, it's not the Slayer itself got changed, but the Slayer has been in one of those ascendancies that's been a strong ascendancy with a whole bunch of bad skills for a while. Well, suddenly a bunch of those bad skills became good, and that made the Slayer good. The Hierophant, perhaps there's a case to be made that some of the Archmage setups are a little bit too strong. Then from there, we have a whole bunch of ascendancies that people have played before. Where I would be worried is if 3.26 looks anything like this. If in 3.26 we see the same 3 ascendancies dominating the leaderboard, then in that case, we do have a genuine problem. We'll burn that bridge when we get to it. So you have 8 ascendancies that have fallen way behind the rest in popularity. But it is worth saying that none of these are terrible. Some of them are quite good over in Tradeland, and other ones, at least they're good at something, even if that something is a little bit off meta. There's a little bit of argument as to whether the Saboteur can be said to be good at anything at all at the moment. I do think it's pretty good at being a fairly defensive miner setup at the moment, or a fairly defensive trapper. It's just that people aren't really looking to play defensive miners and defensive trappers. Instead, they're more keen to go glass cannon. And for that, depending on the exact skill you're using, the Assassin, the Trickster, the Occultist, the Pathfinder, the Inquisitor, all of these can potentially be better choices. For that reason, we're not seeing that many people playing the Saboteur. I do think that if Hexblast mines were worse, then we would see more of the people who are currently playing Hexblast mines moving over to things like Ice Trap. And for skills that deal elemental damage via a proxy like a trap or a mine, there's a little bit more of a reason to use the Saboteur than there is for the Hexblast builds. So, with all of that said, the Saboteur is the one thing that I think might potentially be a little bit too weak. All the rest of the ascendancies, though, they're in a pretty fine place. It's just they're not doing things people are looking to do in solo self-found land at the moment. The main thing, though, is that people are gravitating towards ascendancies that are shiny and new, whereas a lot of the others are feeling old and stale. Things get a little bit different if you focus on level 97 plus or level 100 plus, but it's mostly the same story, just that the Hierophant becomes the dominant ascendancy. Every time that you cut a level from the bottom, you'll find that Hierophants start doing better and better, until they end up as absolutely the top ascendancy when you're looking at level 100. This is due to Archmage. Even though you can do other things with the Hierophant ascendancy, such as spell totems, people aren't really interested in doing that at the moment. People are playing them as Archmages. Archmages tend to play better, and they're a little bit shinier and newer as well. So let's take a look at the 12 top builds so far. Firstly, we have the Archmage Hierophant in number 1. We were just talking about this before. 1,348 of the level 92 plus characters, 70% of these are using Ice Nova of Frostbolts, 20% are using Ball Lightning for orbiting, and the last 10% are spread amongst a bunch of other skills. Of these, 98% of these Archmage builds are Hierophant. That's why I'm calling it the Archmage Hierophant, and not just simply the Archmage. This is very much a one ascendancy build, and what's more, the Hierophant is very much a one build ascendancy at the moment. Even though you can force totems to work with it, basically no one's interested in it because the Archmage builds are just better. And once more, this build goes further and further up the list, so it's already number 1, but it gets even further ahead of everything else, the more tightly that you restrict the levels. If you don't just look at 92, if you start going 95 plus, you start going 99 plus, then you'll find that the Archmage Hierophants will come out further and further ahead. They won't just be number 1, but they'll be higher than numbers 2 and 3 combined. In position 2, we have the first of many Gladiator-based builds, a Lacerate of Hemorrhage. This is being played by 899 players at the moment, and it's something that is just very simple and very effective. This is a build that doesn't need to worry about anything more experimental. For instance, when we get to Eviscerate later, we'll be looking at something that we didn't know was going to work going into the league. We thought it would, it looked good on paper, but Lacerate of Hemorrhage was a proven skill, and of course it got much better with the Gladiator Overhaul. In position 3, we have a skill that is a classic hybrid, part range skill, part melee. This is Lightning Strike. Lightning Strike is a melee strike that emits projectiles as well. Now this has 791 people playing it, and it's mostly played on the Slayer, but with a good number of Wardens and a few people scattered across other ascendancies, such as the Gladiator, the Trickster, and the Deadeye. The main skill, Lightning Strike, is just mediocre, but the fact that it comes with Vile Lightning Strike as well is what really puts this so far ahead of everything else. Lightning Strike on its own is quite solid as a clearing skill, but it's pretty mediocre, even lackluster when it comes to single target. Vile Lightning Strike addresses this problem in spades because it provides you with a really good burst of damage when you really need it on bosses. Essentially, this is a really strong skill, and it got a huge boost from the addition of the Prismatic Tincture, which is something that is just sublime when used on this build. In position 4, we have 653 players who are playing level 92 plus Earthshatter builds. This is a build that is extremely good on the Berserker, the Juggernaut, but also can be played on the Slayer and the Chieftain. And what's interesting here is that Earthshatter is something that is being played over in Tradeland by a very similar number of players. Although in my trade video, I did have a higher level cutoff to get in because, of course, it is easier to level in trade than it is in solo self-found. And then position 5 is a very similar skill, Ground Slam of Earthshaking. There are 507 people playing Ground Slam of Earthshaking, and there's a further 72 who I feel might be looking to transition into Ground Slam of Earthshaking. The reason I think this is that they are using classic Ground Slam on their build, and I suspect that in many cases this is because they've got themselves a Vile Ground Slam, they haven't yet got themselves a Vile Ground Slam that is Ground Slam of Earthshaking, and so those players have decided that for now, they will prefer access to the Vile skill, even though they would rather have the transfigured version of Ground Slam, rather than using the original version, which most players don't feel is quite as good as the transfigured one. This skill hits really hard since the melee reworks. It can be used both as instant application damage and also as a vector for applying bleed. In position 6, we have Power Siphon, one of the wand skills that is universally used with Locus Mines. And when I say universally, I mean by more than 95% of players. Locus Mine support is god tier when it comes to Power Siphon. These two go together extremely well because Locus Mines has tremendous damage and terrible aim, but at the same time, Power Siphon addresses a lot of those aim concerns, making it so that Locus Mines is pretty much an all upside support gem. We have 476 people playing this setup at the moment. In position 7, we have the other major bleed gladiator, the Eviscerate Gladiator. This is a build that I'm playing over in Trade League, and this is a simple, effective, and fun build that does a lot of damage through retaliation skills. One of the things I really like about this is that you get to play around with a lot of the new mechanics on one build. There's different takes on this, but basically they all share a bleed scaling focus, and all of them invest heavily in block. They use Versatile Combatant, they invest into block on the Gladiator Ascendancy, and then they use this in order to power those retaliation skills, with Eviscerate being the main one, and some people but not everyone are opting to use a second retaliation skill with it. There are 415 people who are playing this build currently. In position 8, we have Righteous Fire. This is one of those builds that has been strong for a long time. It's interesting in that it got both nerfs and buffs at the same time with this patch. The nerfs came in the form of reduced defenses because physical damage shifting into elements was made much more difficult to obtain in this patch, and that's the reason that we're not seeing as many people using Lightning Coil. Lightning Coil's still there, it's still extremely good, but it's something that can't quite get as much synergy with other items as it used to have. The other thing to note with Righteous Fire is that fundamentally this is also a fire trap build. And the way that I've counted the builds that are put down for this, I've counted everyone who has a 5-linked Righteous Fire and or a 5-linked Fire Trap. So I might miss the odd hipster that's running 4-link Righteous Fire and some different alternative to Fire Trap like Searing Bond. But on the base versions, we got 395 people who are using this setup. This is one of those builds that's extremely good at clearing, and that has a number of problems with certain pinnacle bosses. Most notably the Maven. The Maven is absolutely terrible for this build because the Maven is very good at turning off your regeneration, and when you turn off regeneration on a Righteous Fire build, the Righteous Fire build has a bad day. In position 9, we have Spectral Shield Throw. Now, this is a very different build to previous incarnations of Spectral Shield Throw. In the past, we have seen instant application critical strike builds that convert physical damage into cold, and that mostly play on the Trickster. You can still play those builds still work. The thing is that people are playing shiny and new this league, and that is why overwhelmingly the SST people are not using Spectral Shield Throw for instant application crit damage, but instead they're using it as a vector to apply devastating bleeds to enemies, and of course doing so on the reworked Gladiator Ascendancy. 347 people playing this, and I think over 340 of them are playing one of the bleed variants that was not really viable at all last league. And in position 10, we have Resolute Technique Sunder builds. Now this is a big drop down in the number of players. We're down to 140 people playing this, so this is the big jump between the popular builds and the ones that are a little bit less popular. This is often played as a Gladiator, but there's lots of variety in this. The most important first question you want to ask is, am I scaling non-critical strike instant application damage, or am I trying to scale bleed? If your answer to that question is, I want to scale bleed, you probably want to go Gladiator. If you want to scale the instant application damage, then you probably want to go something else. The other really significant decision you'll make, as well as the bleed decision, is whether you want to go one hand and shield, or whether you want to go two-hander. There is no correct answer, and whilst it might be reasonable to split this into two builds, with one of them being for each, I've just chosen to bundle them together. The one thing that I am keeping in there though is that they're all using Resolute Technique, which is something that transforms the way that you value gear, and it's something that transforms the way that you build your passive tree. In position 11, we have the Earthquake builds. Now this is mostly being played, but not exclusively as a bleed Gladiator. Of 138 people whose primary skill is Earthquake in the league, 25 of them are instant application, non-critical strike chieftains, and almost all of the rest of them, so over 100, are bleed Gladiators. There's a lot to explore here, and again, this feels like it's more than one build. I'm grouping together people based on the skill they've used here, but you could argue that the bleed Gladiators are just a different build entirely to those that are playing instant application damage on a chieftain. And in position 12, we have the build that is number 2 over in Tradeland, and that is Hexblast Mines. Hexblast and Mines go together incredibly well. Hexblast does a huge amount of damage, but it also has one of the longest cast times around, a full second by default, and additionally it has a lot of things that prevent you from triggering it through the use of things like cast on critical strike. However, you can bypass a lot of this with either blast chain mine support, or the much more popular in this case, high impact mine support. High impact mines linked to Hexblast is something that has been tearing up Trade League for a good reason, and that is because it is the best build in the game for clearing the Sanctum. Of course, over in Solo Self-Found, you can't really sustain Sanctum content, but this is a build that is good at pretty much everything in the game. It's just that it's even better when it comes to clearing the Sanctum. In Solo Self-Found, most people elect to run this as a trickster. It's not the only Ascendancy you can play, that's just the most popular one. Honestly, it's my opinion that this should probably be higher up the list. I think the reason it's not is a lot of people have already played it, and if there's one thing that I've learned from talking to people who play Solo Self-Found, they love playing different builds. Each league, they'll run something different, and for that reason, a lot of people who might have thought the best choice is Hexblast Mines have then gone and played something else shiny and new instead. A quick look at some breakout uniques this league. There are 231 people using Rezlatha's Coil. You might think 231 is a small number. The thing is that this unique is rare. For an item that is this rare, having 231 people using it that are level 92 plus is really, really unusual. For comparison, the taming is something that I suspect is about 12 times as common. That's because the rarest component of the vendor recipe for the taming, which is Beric's Respite, is something that is a tier 3 rarity unique, compared to Rezlatha's Coil's tier 1. And it seems to be, judging by the comparative rarity of the Divination card for Beric's Respite and the rarity of the Offspring card for Rezlatha's Coil, the Rezlatha's Coil may be about 12 times as rare. However, only 408 people are using the taming. The taming is a really good item. This is something that a lot of people are using over in Tradeland. I think what's going on here is that a section of the most dedicated and determined farmers within the Solo Self-Found player base saw the opportunity to make Rezlatha's Coil work and were like, you know what? I am going to go absolutely bonkers and farm myself a set of the Divination card for Rezlatha's Coil. Another thing I want to point out, there's already 131 Magebloods doing the rounds in Solo Self-Found on level 92 plus characters. That's quite a lot, especially given that I think there would be a fair number of players for whom the response to getting a lucky unexpected Mageblood drop would actually be to go and transfer it over to Trade League so that they can build around it over there. A couple of final thoughts on the meta for this league. I think it'd be really interesting to watch the way this evolves as time goes on. Normally I don't do follow-up videos on the league meta videos, but I think I might have to do it this league because I do think there's going to be some changes as the league ages, as people work out what of the new tech, what of the new builds is the real deal, what was just good enough to get going, and what is something that you wouldn't repeat in the future. All of this information is going to take a few weeks to start really being worked out by the player base, and at that point we'll start to see some changes in what the meta looks like. The other thing that I think will be interesting is that tier 17 maps Whilst they're still pretty challenging, they're a lot easier than they used to be. Tier 17 maps without any delirium layers applied last league had as much monster damage as Tier 17 maps with 100% delirium this league. And the consequence there is that player power doesn't necessarily need to be quite as high in order to beat Tier 17 map bosses as it did in the past. That's going to be interesting to see what the consequences are as far as build diversity goes. I think this is going to be an opportunity for builds that are not necessarily the very, very best to shine brighter than they have in the past. Anyways, I'm going to leave it there. May your Varlobs have interesting results.